Alrighty. At my mother's funeral, my uncle Ray Walker stood up from the second pew without anyone asking him to. His face, always hardened by years of bitterness, was twisted into something even colder that day. He cleared his throat, adjusted his faded tie, and spat out the words like they'd been simmering inside him for years. She deserved to die alone, he said, his voice slicing through the heavy silence of the chapel like a knife through glass. Before anyone could even react, my cousin Ty Walker, lounging in his seat with arms crossed like he was at some lousy school assembly, chimed in, sneering. "Yeah, no one loved her anyway," he muttered loud enough to echo off the wood-paneled walls. I sat there frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as if the air itself had turned against me. My fingers clenched tightly around the crumpled tissue in my lap, the only thing I had left to hold on to. Every cruel word they threw felt like a slap, not just to me, but to the memory of my mom, Linda Walker, who, no matter her faults, didn't deserve this kind of burial. People shuffled awkwardly in their seats. Chairs creaked. Eyes darted to the floor, to the stained glass windows, to anywhere but me. Not a word came from the pastor, who stood stiff behind the pulpit, his hands folded neatly, his face blank like he'd seen it all before, and didn't plan to intervene. No one in the family dared to challenge Ray or Ty. It was like they all silently agreed with them, or maybe they were just too cowardly to speak up. Then, when I thought the humiliation couldn't sink any deeper, the back doors of the chapel groaned open. A gust of cold air followed a tall man in a dark green army dress uniform. He stepped inside quietly, his posture upright, his face set with a seriousness that made people straighten in their seats just from his presence alone. He looked to be in his late 30s, clean-shaven, his boots clicking sharply against the linoleum floor with each slow, deliberate step. He didn't glance at the congregation, didn't even acknowledge the whispers starting to ripple through the room. His eyes stayed locked on the casket at the front, where my mother lay in peaceful stillness beneath a blanket of lilies she would have thought were too extravagant. The man walked straight to her, paused at the casket, and removed his cap with a reverence that made the entire room hold its breath. For a moment he just stood there, as if saying a silent prayer, or letting 1,000 memories wash over him. Then softly, but with a weight that seemed to shake the very air, he said, "I owe her everything." The words fell into the room like a boulder tossed into a still lake. Every whisper died, every stare snapped to him. No one moved, no one dared to even blink. None of us had any idea who this man was. Not me, not Uncle Ray, not even the pastor, who now looked more like a man wishing he'd brought a different sermon. And in that moment, as the stranger stood by my mother's side, speaking words of debt and gratitude, no one expected everything I thought I knew about my mom, and the people who claimed to know her best crumbled right beneath my feet. Sometimes moments like that don't just shatter your past, they demand you pick up the pieces and start rewriting the story from scratch in your own words, your own voice. That's what I'm doing here. And if these kinds of stories, messy, raw human stories about unseen heroes and unspoken legacies, mean something to you the way they do to me, I hope you'll stay with me on this journey. You can like, share, and subscribe if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, not buried. Because stories like my mom's don't always get told unless someone decides they should. Let me take you back, not to a warm memory, not to a place of comfort, but to a house steeped in an unsettling kind of silence. It wasn't the cinematic stillness you see in films, the kind that suggests peace or closure. No, this was a suffocating quiet, the heavy, damp kind that drapes itself around your shoulders like a sodden wool blanket, suffocating, inescapable. Every creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet seemed to echo louder in that absence of life. Even the ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall felt like a cruel reminder that time for my mother had already stopped. I sat at her kitchen table, the same scratched oak surface where she used to scrawl grocery lists on the backs of receipts and overdue bills, the same place where we used to sit in silence over mugs of cheap instant coffee, both of us too stubborn to say what we really felt. Now, the table felt like an altar to the mundane fragments of her life untouched since the day she collapsed on that threadbare couch in the living room. Her chipped ceramic coffee mug, the one with the faded sunflower print, still sat by the sink, stained from years of bad coffee and lonely mornings. Her old scarf, a threadbare thing more holes than fabric, still draped over the back of her chair, as if she might stroll in from the cold and wrap it around her shoulders without a word. But she wasn't coming back. She never would. My name is Jessica Walker, though most call me Jess. I'm 33, though some days the weight of everything makes me feel twice that. My mother, Linda Walker, was to most people in our small, judgmental town little more than a cautionary tale whispered about at church bake sales and family cookouts. Her name dropped like a warning, a what not, to become stories shared in hushed tones behind cupped hands. But to me, she was something entirely different. She was raw, battered strength made flesh. She was stubbornness that cut both ways. She was chaos in an old flannel shirt. Yes, she was flawed. Yes, her life was messy, tangled in debts and shadows and choices that never made it into polite conversation. But beneath it all, she had a heart that kept on giving long after the world stopped giving her anything in return. Planning her funeral had been like trying to arrange a farewell for someone who never really got a proper hello. The phone never rang. There were no casseroles at the door, no awkward offers of help from the cousins. There was just me sitting in that stale-smelling office with the funeral director answering questions that made me want to scream. Was there a church she belonged to? Should we expect a crowd? I wanted to throw the answer in their face. No, she didn't go to church. The church judged her the same way the family did. And no, don't expect a crowd. Expect a war. My uncle Ray Walker had already made his venom clear. He hadn't spoken to my mom in over a decade, not since the divorce, the debt, the quiet disgrace. He carried his bitterness like a family heirloom, polishing it until it gleamed in the faces of anyone who would listen. His son, Ty Walker, my cousin, was worse. He had taken that bitterness and turned it into armor, wearing it proudly like he had inherited it along with the family name. I should have braced myself for what they were going to say at the funeral. I should have known better than to think they'd keep their mouths shut for even one damn day. But foolishly, somewhere in the pit of my stomach, I still held on to the naive hope that they might let her rest in peace. The funeral took place in a cramped, dimly lit room at Ridgemont Memorial, the kind of place that reeked of old varnished wood and wilted flowers, with a sickly undertone of potpourri that failed to mask the scent of grief and forgotten promises. A dozen people, maybe less, sat scattered among the pews, looking more like they'd stumbled into the wrong room than gathered to say goodbye. Some of her coworkers from the grocery store were there, faces stiff with awkwardness. A couple of neighbors sat near the back whispering. There was even a woman I didn't recognize seated alone, her shoulders quaking silently as she wept into a handkerchief. I wore my mother's silver locket that day, the one she always told me was a gift from someone she once loved, though she never said who. I remember once as a kid asking her about it, and she just smiled that cryptic smile of hers and said, "Some stories don't start until after you're gone, Jess." I didn't understand it then. I'm not sure I fully do now. The pastor, a man who had never met her and made no attempt to hide it, read a lifeless prayer reciting her name as if it were just another line in his well-worn script. There was no warmth in his tone, no flicker of understanding in his expression. It stung, but I sat still, grinding my nails into my palms. This day wasn't about me. At least that's what I told myself. And then Ray Walker stood up. No one had asked him to speak. He didn't glance at me as he made his way to the front, adjusting the microphone like he was about to deliver some noble eulogy. But there was nothing noble about the words that spilled from his mouth. "Let's not pretend she was someone she wasn't," Ray sneered, his voice curling with contempt. "Linda chose her path. She pushed everyone away. She died alone because that's what she earned." Gasps shuddered through the room, but no one moved to stop him. My jaw locked. My fists shook in my lap, but I stayed silent as Ty, lounging in his seat like he owned the place, smirked and added, "No one loved her anyway." And still no one told him to shut up. Not the pastor, not the neighbors, not the coworkers. The room filled with whispers, murmurs, the sound of eyes dropping, shoulders turning inward. No one defended her. No one stood up. Not until something deep inside me cracked wide open, a swirling tempest of grief rage and a fierce aching love that made my throat burn. I pushed my chair back, breath catching in my chest, ready to speak, ready to fight. And that's when the back doors creaked open. He walked in as if summoned by the universe itself. A stranger in a perfectly pressed army dress uniform stepping into the suffocating room like a ghost from some other life. He looked to be in his late 30s, clean-shaven, serious eyes that told stories I couldn't yet begin to read. He carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind forged in battles both seen and unseen. He didn't glance around the room, didn't flinch at the tension crackling in the air. He just walked one deliberate step after another, boots echoing off the cold floor until he stood in front of my mother's casket. He removed his cap with practiced reverence, lowered his head, and placed a hand gently on the edge of the coffin, as though greeting an old friend. And then in a voice that was soft but filled every corner of the room, he spoke words that shattered everything. I owe her everything. The room froze as if the stranger's words had snatched the very breath from everyone's lungs and suspended it in the heavy, dust-thick air. Even the woman sobbing quietly in the back halted mid-wail, clutching her dampened handkerchief to her mouth in stunned silence. The pastor blinked, mouth parted, like he wanted to say something, but no words came. He, like the rest of us, was caught in the undertow of something larger than decorum, larger than grief. Even Ray Walker, who had stormed to the front of the room moments earlier, fueled by a decade of resentments, sat frozen lips twitching, but no sound daring to follow. The man turned then, slow and deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the pews with the calm authority of someone who had seen battlefields far worse than this suffocating funeral parlor. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with a scalpel's precision. "I know none of you know me," he said, his tone neither bitter nor pleading, just resolute like a man reciting an oath carved into his soul. "But I knew Linda Walker better than most of you ever cared to. She saved my life." His words landed in the pit of my stomach, knocking the breath from me. He turned his attention to me, his eyes locking onto mine with such piercing certainty I felt stripped bare, like he could see every fracture, every ache I'd buried beneath layers of quiet. "You must be her daughter," he said softly, like an offering, like a hand reaching across a chasm. I nodded, not trusting my voice, my head swimming in confusion as the room spun in its stunned inertia. From somewhere near the front, Ray grumbled under his breath, venom still curling at the corners of his mouth. "Saved his life. Sure she did." He sneered, the sarcasm in his voice like oil on water. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his gaze squarely on my uncle, his posture remaining calm, but his stance unyielding like a soldier facing down an enemy line. "You don't have to believe me," he said, each word, deliberate, controlled, but heavy with something unshakable. "But I'm going to tell you anyway." He drew in a long breath, grounding himself in the memory he was about to resurrect. 20 years ago, I was just a 17-year-old kid abandoned by the system, washed out of foster care with no family, no roadmap, no one left to give a damn. Both my parents had passed, and I had no siblings, no safety net. I was sleeping behind a dumpster off 3rd and Ridge, scraping by on scraps, and anger, the kind of anger that eats at you until you're hollow. The room hung on his words, breaths held captive in their chests. One night, he continued, this woman came out the back door of the grocery store with a bag of trash. She saw me sitting there half frozen. She didn't scream. She didn't call the cops. She asked me one question. "Are you hungry?" He paused, then eyes scanning the sea of stunned faces. "That woman was your sister, your aunt, your mother, Linda Walker. And from that night on, she made sure I didn't go to sleep cold or hungry. Every night for 3 months, she brought me food, a blanket from the trunk of her beat-up Chevy, and not once did she make me feel like I was something broken to fix. She treated me like a person." I swallowed hard, my throat tightening, my vision blurring with tears I refused to let fall, not yet. My mother had never spoken of this, not once. She didn't preach, she didn't judge, she didn't ask anything of me, and when I told her I wanted to join the army, she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Then you better stop sleeping behind dumpsters and start standing up straight." And the next day she handed me a bus ticket to the recruiter's office. I caught sight of Ty slouched in his seat, whispering something smug to his father. Ray shifted, uncomfortable now, but said nothing. The man ignored them both, his focus fixed on the story only he could tell. "I served 3 tours," he went on. "I built a career. I have a wife, 2 kids, a home. I mentor at-risk youth, now kids, who look just like I did back then. And every time I help someone, every time I see a kid stand a little taller because someone believed in them, it's because of her." His voice wavered for the first time as he turned back toward the casket. "She may not have been loved by all of you, but she was loved by me. She was respected by me. And I know I'm not the only one. She left a mark. You all just never looked close enough to see it." The dam inside me broke, then hot tears spilling over. But for the first time that day, they weren't born solely of grief. They were something else, something sharper, fiercer. Ray made one last attempt to salvage control, rising stiffly, his voice brittle with old wounds. "You don't know what she did to this family," he spat, his tone daring the stranger to challenge him. The man stepped closer, his calm now carrying the weight of iron. "Maybe not, but I know what she did for me, and that counts for something. That counts for everything." Ray faltered, jaw clenched tight, words abandoned. Ty crossed his arms, turning away, lips pressed into a sulky line. But the power in the room had shifted, and they both knew it. When I looked around again, I saw something that hadn't been there before. The crowd, once whispering, once quick to avert their gaze, now watched and listened. Faces softened, heads nodded. Even the woman in the back wiped her eyes, no longer crying out of sadness, but something closer, to reverence. My mother, the woman they had dismissed, ignored, written off, had been resurrected in their eyes. Not as the town's failure, not as the family's embarrassment, but as a quiet savior, a woman whose kindness rippled through lives she never told me about. I rose, then, legs trembling beneath me, heart hammering against my ribs, and faced the room, my voice shaking but determined. "That was my mom," I said, "all of her, and I won't let her be remembered as anything less." And in the silence that followed, full not awkward, charged with something unspoken, the conflict didn't fester anymore. It transformed. It became something holy. I barely remember sitting back down. My hands still trembled, my pulse raced like I'd run a marathon inside the confines of that suffocating room. Anthony Vega, that man with the soldier's bearing and the stranger's face, had cracked open everything I thought was settled. The lies, the omissions, the shadows my family had used to distort my mother's life into something small and shameful. For too long I had let them define her, let them shape her memory into something hollow and pitiful. Because she struggled, because she didn't host church brunches or bake perfect pies. I let them make me believe she didn't matter. But now, standing there among the peeling wallpaper and wilting lilies, I knew better. She mattered. She mattered to someone, and that meant she mattered to the world. After the service ended, the crowd thinned out quickly like cowards fleeing the truth they couldn't unhear. Her co-workers offered me murmured condolences, their eyes wide with something close to shame. Ty stormed out, no words, just a scowl thrown over his shoulder. Ray lingered near the exit, stiff lips twitching like he wanted to say something, but he never found the courage. And to be honest, I didn't care if he ever did. What mattered most in the aftermath of that shattering service wasn't the awkward condolences, the hollow apologies, or even the grim-faced family members who slunk away into the drizzle of the parking lot like shadows dissolving at dusk. What mattered was Anthony Vega still lingering by my mother's casket, his posture reverent, unmoving, as if he too wasn't ready to let her go, not yet. There was something unspoken in the way he stood there, a stillness that mirrored the ache inside me, a quiet refusal to let her be reduced to the bitterness swirling in that suffocating room. I found myself walking toward him, each step hesitant, my body moving before my mind could catch up, propelled by a need I couldn't quite name yet. My hands trembled, but my voice, though unsteady, emerged clear. "Can I ask you something?" I whispered the words, more breath than sound. He turned, his gaze softening as he nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Of course," he replied gently, like someone who already knew the weight of the question before it was asked. "Why today? Why come now?" My voice cracked beneath the question, the ache raw and bleeding behind it. Anthony inhaled deeply, his chest rising with the burden of years he carried like an old wound. "Because for 20 years I promised myself I'd find a way to thank her." He said his words heavy with regret and something deeper, unfinished promises, unspoken debts. But she moved, changed numbers. She didn't want to be found, I guess. I only heard about her passing 2 days ago. Someone from the old store posted it online. I drove all night. "You didn't have to," I murmured, though. Even as I said it, I knew the futility in the words. "I did," he replied, his voice firm, anchored in something immovable. "People like your mom, they don't get parades or statues or headlines, but they should get remembered. They deserve that much." I swallowed hard, my throat thick with a lump that refused to move. All I could do was nod, holding back the tide behind my eyes. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, his movements deliberate, and retrieved a worn, faded photograph. He handed it to me with care, like an artifact, like something sacred. I stared at it, my mother, much younger, standing beside a scrawny teenage boy with a buzz cut and hollow eyes. They stood outside a weathered old diner, and she had her arm around his shoulder, laughing, radiating the kind of warmth I barely remembered seeing at home. I've kept this with me ever since she gave me that bus ticket, Anthony said softly, almost reverently. She told me to take a picture, so I'd never forget I wasn't invisible. I pressed the photo to my chest, the paper cool against my skin, the truth behind it burning into me. She had never told me about him about any of this. She never spoke of the things she did for others. She only talked about me. She wanted me to walk lighter, to be unburdened by the shadows she carried alone. And here I was letting men like Ray Walker drag her memory through the filth she had fought so hard to rise above. Not anymore. That night I went home, numb but electric inside, like a live wire sparking beneath the skin. I sat at her cluttered old desk, the one where unpaid bills mingled with clipped recipes and fragments of grocery lists scribbled on napkins and the backs of envelopes. Her world messy and human, layered in paper and ink. Buried beneath the chaos, I found a weathered notebook. The pages inside were filled with letters she had written to me, some rambling, some unfinished, others so raw they made my hands tremble as I turned them. One page, darker ink, steadier hand, caught my eye. If you're reading this, she had written, it means I'm gone. I hope I made you proud. I know I wasn't always easy to love, but I tried. God, I tried. Not just for me, for you. I didn't want you to become me. But maybe now I realize there's nothing wrong with being someone who fights hard and loves quiet. The dam broke then, and I let it. I let the sobs wrench out of me, shaking and ugly, filling the empty house with a sound that felt like both grief and release. And when the tears finally ebbed, something inside me solidified. I wouldn't let her story die in that bitter, narrow room. I wouldn't let the loudest voices rewrite her life just because they shouted louder than the quiet truth she lived. I opened my laptop and began writing. At first just a journal entry, then a post, then a letter to the local paper. I wrote about the woman who took in strangers, the woman who worked herself raw on 2 jobs and still came home to stir a pot of soup for anyone who needed it. The woman who taught me to be kind when no one was watching, who taught me that love didn't need an audience to matter. I didn't care if anyone believed me. I knew the truth now, and I would make sure the world did too. If my mother could change someone's life with a bowl of soup and a warm blanket, the least I could do was change how she was remembered. Starting with her name, Linda Walker, a woman who saved lives without needing to be seen. A few days after the funeral, I received a message from Anthony. It was brief, a sentence, an address. You should see this. She never stopped helping. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to stay cocooned in the fragile warmth of the memories I had only just unearthed. Just me, my mom, and the fragile pages of her hidden strength. But curiosity tugged at me, stubborn as ever. If there was more to her story, I owed it to her to see it. The address led me to a tired old community center about an hour outside town. The sign was chipped, the front steps groaned beneath my feet, but inside the walls were alive. Covered in artwork, messy poems, vivid, aching paintings that screamed of survival and struggle. The kind of art that only comes from people who have weathered storms no one else can see. At the front desk, a woman greeted me, her smile soft but knowing. You must be Jessica, she said. I blinked, caught off guard. Yes. How did you... Anthony said you might come, she replied, motioning for me to follow. She led me down a narrow hallway into a small, cozy room lined with mismatched chairs and sagging bookshelves. On the far wall, a bulletin board stood covered in Polaroids, but it was the framed photograph on the wall that stole the breath from my lungs. It was my mother, younger, maybe mid-40s, wearing a worn denim jacket, cradling a tray of cupcakes like she was presenting a feast. Around her, 3 kids beamed up at her, as if she had hung the moon herself. The caption beneath it read, Miss Lenny, our anchor. She volunteered here, I managed to ask, my voice barely more than a whisper. The woman nodded, her eyes softening with memory. More than that, she saved this place. We were about to close. No funding, no staff. She walked in one day and asked if we needed help. And she never stopped. She cleaned, she cooked, she tutored kids after school. She ran writing workshops for teens who wouldn't speak to anyone else. She never wanted credit, she just showed up. The tears came before I could stop them, hot and insistent. She never told me any of this, I choked out. She didn't do it to be remembered, the woman said gently. She did it because she knew what it felt like to be invisible. I walked over to the bulletin board, tracing the photos with my fingertips, absorbing every word scribbled in the margins. In each picture, she looked not just happy, but at peace, as if in this small, forgotten place, she had finally found the version of herself the rest of the world refused to see. Her eyes, those weary, heavy-lidded eyes that so often returned home at night, rimmed with exhaustion, dulled by the weight of invisible wars, sparkled in the photographs pinned to the bulletin board. They shimmered with a joy I could scarcely remember seeing in her face beneath the dim glow of our kitchen light. In these images she looked radiant, alive in a way that made my throat ache, as though these strangers had known a side of her I had been too blinded by my own sadness to recognize. There were notes handwritten and curling at the edges, taped haphazardly around the photos. I leaned closer, tracing them as though the ink might reveal something more than words, something essential about the mother I had failed to see clearly until now. Miss Lenny taught me how to write my first story, one note read in messy, hopeful script. When I wanted to drop out, she told me my voice mattered. I believed her, said another. I pressed my fingers to the paper, absorbing their gratitude like oxygen after a lifetime of drowning. She had not been the woman my family painted her as in their harsh, shallow sketches. Not the disgrace they whispered about in pews and around cold dining tables. She hadn't lived a small, pitiful life. She had lived a life unseen, hidden beneath layers of quiet power, of small, stubborn acts that rippled out into places she never sought credit for. For years I had worn her story like a shroud of tragedy draped in bitterness and old wounds. But now I saw it for what it truly was, a story of survival, of sacrifice, of a woman who gave love that didn't demand applause or recognition to matter. When I finally stepped back outside, the air had turned cooler, the sky settling into that dusky lavender of early evening. Anthony Vega was waiting, leaning against his weathered truck, hands deep in his pockets, his gaze lost somewhere in the horizon. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence sit heavy between us. She came here every Thursday, he finally said, breaking the hush like a confession, his voice low tinged with something close to reverence. Rain or shine. I didn't know this version of her, I whispered more to myself than to him, my voice cracking under the enormity of all I had just witnessed. He nodded, eyes still watching the bruised sky. Most people didn't, he replied, but it's not too late to tell that story. And in that instant, like a switch being flipped in a darkened room, I knew what I had to do. That night, I opened the draft I had started after the funeral, the one I had abandoned in anger and grief, and I rewrote every word. This time, it wasn't an act of defense. It wasn't about fighting back against the lies my family clung to. It was about celebrating her, the whole of her. I included the photo from the center, the scribbled notes from the kids whose lives she'd touched, Anthony's words, and even a few passages from the notebook she'd left me, raw, unpolished, achingly honest. I told the story of a woman the world had dismissed, a woman who refused to discard anyone even when life discarded her, and when I hit publish I didn't expect much. I certainly didn't expect the flood. Within hours, the post spread, picked up by strangers, by voices I'd never heard. They shared it, commented, sent their own stories, people who had crossed her path, kids she'd fed at the shelter, former co-workers who remembered how she always brought extra sandwiches for the new hires too, broke to afford lunch. One comment pierced through the noise like a beacon. I never knew her name, but she gave me a blanket when I was 13, sleeping under a bridge. Thank you for reminding me who she was. Another read simply, she was a quiet hero. Thank you for making her loud. And that was when it finally settled in my bones. My mother had never needed the world to see her. She just needed one person brave enough to tell the truth. And that person was going to be me. 3 months have passed since that funeral, but still, every time I drive past Ridgemont Memorial, a pang blooms deep in my chest, a cocktail of grief, pride, and something softer, like gratitude. Because now, it's not just sorrow that shows up. It's the knowledge that she mattered. Not just to me, but to the countless lives she brushed against like a quiet, constant lighthouse in the chaos of their storms. Since that post, something unexpected happened. The story didn't just resonate, it moved, rippled outward into places I never dared dream it would. A local reporter called, then a national blog, and suddenly Linda Walker. My mother was no longer a footnote in someone else's bitter narrative. She was a feature, a name spoken with reverence instead of ridicule. Danielle Danny Martinez. One of the kids from the community center, though she wasn't a kid anymore, 24 now, and standing on the cusp of her own life, reached out to me. She told me my mother had kept her in school when her family life crumbled beneath her feet. She arrived at the center with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and more anger than hope. She didn't try to fix me, Danny told me. She just listened. And when I failed a class, she told me failing wasn't the end unless I decided to stay there. Now, Danny was in her final year of college, studying to be a social worker because of my mother. There were others, too. A woman who had spent her 20s bouncing between shelters shared how my mom had given her a pair of boots one winter, then sat with her while she cried in the freezing dark. A former co-worker remembered the handwritten notes of encouragement she used to leave in the break room, scribbled quotes about strength, survival, and the courage to get back up when the world knocks you down. And then there was the letter. I found it tucked inside the last book she had been reading, not tucked in a cinematic flourish, but quietly, in a plain white envelope, my name written in her uneven scrawl. Inside, she wrote, "If you ever wonder what I was trying to do with this life, the answer is simple. I wanted to give back what I never got. I wanted to prove that being broken didn't mean being useless. And if even one person remembers me as someone who made things feel a little less heavy, then I'll call that a win." I read that letter every week now, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently pressing my hand against the worn paper, like it might still hold the warmth of her touch. My relationship with my family didn't magically heal. Ray Walker hasn't spoken to me since that day at the chapel. Ty sent me a text, short and half-hearted, accusing me of being dramatic, of making a saint out of someone who screwed up. But their approval no longer mattered to me. I used to think defending my mother meant convincing them she was better than they claimed. Now I understand it was never about them. It was about the truth. And the truth is, my mother was human. She struggled. She made hard choices. But through it all, she chose kindness. She chose to lift others even when she was sinking. She chose to love even when it hurt. Maybe the world didn't give her standing ovations. Maybe most of it never even noticed. But I see it now. Every long shift, every warm blanket, every small act of love she never sought credit for. I started a scholarship in her name, the Linda Walker Quiet Light Fund, for students who grew up in shelters or aged out of foster care kids who just needed someone to believe in them, the way she had believed in Anthony and Danny, in all the lost souls who stumbled into her quiet orbit. Sometimes I still hear her voice in my head, tired, soft, honest as ever. Just be kind, baby girl, even if no one sees it, especially then. That's who she was. And if I ever have a daughter, I'll tell her the same thing. I'll tell her about Linda Walker not as the woman our family gave up on, but as the woman who never gave up on others. As the woman who saved lives with soup, with words, with silence, and with a stubborn hope that refused to be extinguished. She didn't die alone. She died remembered. And more than that, she died having made the world a little lighter, one unseen miracle at a time. If this story moved you, if it stirred thoughts of someone in your life who gave quietly, who loved deeply, who lifted others without ever asking for anything in return, do one thing today. Remember them, speak their name, tell their story. And if you believe these stories of unseen kindness, silent strength, and redemption in the least expected places deserve to be heard, I hope you'll like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Tell me about the quiet heroes in your life, the ones who changed everything without needing to be noticed. I read every word, and I respond when I can. And if you're new here, or if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing to this channel. I share stories that dig deep into what it means to love, to lose, and to live with fierce, unflinching purpose. Thank you for listening.